I just finished planing my board down to thickness. So I've got my thickness, now I need to worry about my width and my length. Both those operations can be done on our table saw. Okay, so before we use the table saw, we need to have one flat face and one straight edge. And we did that on the jointer already. So we're all set. I marked the two good surfaces with pencil here to tell me what surfaces need to stay down into the fence while I'm cutting. Okay, so everything's marked out ready for me. So we need to set up the table saw for a rip. So the first thing I'm going to do is shut off my main power. Okay, that way I can lift up my guards and set the height of the saw blade. When I set the height of the saw blade, it can't be this high above the board. That's way too much. Okay, so what we want is for the top of the saw blade here to be 1/8 to 1/4 of an inch above the board. All right, so we're going to adjust it with one of our wheels up in front here. This wheel in front adjusts the height of the blade. So I'm going to unlock the wheel right here. Then I can take the wheel itself and I'm going to turn it down until that blade is just above the board, that 1/8 to 1/4 of an inch above the board. And then when you turn it down, you always want to finish by turning it up just a little bit. That way the blade doesn't knock down on you while you're using the machine. Once you have that height set, now I'm going to turn this knob again and lock the height adjustment. Okay, this wheel over on this side, right here, this one adjusts the tilt of the blade. If I look back behind my front wheel, I can see this little gauge for the angle at which the blade is resting. It should be pointed to 0. You can kind of see it back through here. Okay, so you never really need to mess with this wheel unless you're going to make some sort of bevel or chamfer cut. Okay, but it's a good idea to look and make sure that it is perfectly straight and 90 degrees. That way you will be able to rip your edge square to the face. So now you can see that the blade is just above the board. It's around 1/4 of an inch above the board. So the height of the blade is all set. Next thing we need to do is set up the width. Okay, so we're going to use the fence over here and move it closer to the blade to get the width that we're looking for. The best way to get an accurate width is to take one of these combination squares and set it so it's flush right here. To do that, I'm just going to unlock it, set it down on my flat surface, push the blade down tight to the table, then lock it in place. Okay, so now I can take a measurement that is perpendicular from my fence. Okay, we always have to have something guiding the board. When we're ripping, we're going to use the rip fence. When we're cross-cutting, we'll use the miter gauge. But we never want a free-handed cut. Okay? If the board gets out of the cut line, what happens is something called a kickback. It's a sudden violent thrust upward and back of the material, which actually comes back at about 102 miles per hour. Okay, so we don't want that to happen. We want the board to stay in that straight cut line, and our rip fence is going to help us do that. Okay, so right now my board is at 5 7/8 inches. I'm going to set this up for 5 1/2 inches. So I'm going to keep it tight to my rip fence. I'm going to slide it over. Now I'm going to match up the ruler on my combination square to the edge of the tooth right here. Okay, so everything that comes through this space here on this side of the blade, that's what's left for my board width. Okay, so I need to be accurate right here and make sure that the edge of the blade closest to the fence is set to my 5 1/2 inches. Okay, so that's all set. I'm going to lock my fence down, then I can put my guards in place. I'm going to take that flat face, put it down to the table. The straight edge is going up against the fence. And we're going to rip off this rough edge right here. Okay, whenever I'm cutting a rip cut, I'm going to stand to the left of the blade. So I'm going to be standing right here while I'm cutting. Okay, that way I can push the board tight to the fence. If I stand over here on the outside of my rip fence, what happens is people kind of push the board away from the fence. When that happens, it gets out of the cut line, and that's when kickbacks happen. So the best place to stand while making a rip cut is to the left of the blade. If your hands are going to come within 4 inches, which is our safety clearance for the table saw, we need to use a push block or a push stick. There's lots of different varieties of push sticks. We've got these manufactured ones, we've got some other ones, we've got some push blocks, some other push sticks, all sorts of different styles. Okay, so just take whichever one works best for you. In this case, this push block is going to fit through here just right. Okay, so I'm going to use this. Our height is set. We've got a 4-inch safety clearance. I've got my push block. So now I just need to push the material through. I also need to worry about what's going to happen after I make my cut. Okay, it's my responsibility to push this board all the way past the blade, all the way through the cut. When that happens, the board's going to want to fall off the table saw. So your options are to either have someone catch the board for you or put a table over there so the board doesn't fall and get damaged. So I'm going to go and find a work table and put it over there to catch my board. So now I've got my table in place and I'm ready to make this cut. If you're having somebody catch the board, their job is just to keep the board from falling on the ground. They cannot pull the board through the cut. If they do, they could get it off line and it could cause a kickback. Okay, so it's up to the person making the cut to push the board all the way through. The person catching cannot pull the board all the way through. Okay, I'm all ready to rip. I've got something to catch my board, so I just need to turn on my main power. Then I'll turn on the saw. I'm standing to the left of the blade, okay, as I look at the machine. I'm going to take my left hand, I'm going to hold it tight against the fence, and just kind of guide the board through. Let it slide through my hand. My other hand is going to push the board all the way through the cut. Okay, so keep it tight to the fence. Push the board all the way past the blade. Then I can shut off my table saw. I'm going to wait for the blade to stop before I remove this scrap. Okay, the blade is stopped, so now I'm going to take something other than my hand and get that scrap out of there. Once it's out, then you can throw it in the scrap bin. Okay, so we just did a ripping operation and we got our board down to it should be 5.5 inches. Yes, it's right on. Okay, so we've got our thickness, we've got our width, now we've got to worry about our length. So we've got 2 ends here that need to be cross-cut yet. So I'm going to get rid of my rip fence, and this time I'm going to use the miter gauge to do my cross-cutting and guide the board. So I'm going to put the miter gauge in this first little channel here to begin with. I just want to square up one end. Okay, so the miter gauge should be square to the blade. If it's not, then you're not going to have a square end. We just need to shave a little bit off of this side. So I'm going to line it up by eye. I'm going to hold it tight to the miter gauge. Okay, hold it tight to the miter gauge. Turn on my saw. Make my first cross cut. Now you can check it to make sure that it's square. If it's not, you might have to do another cross cut. Now for the last end here, the last end that needs to be squared up and cut to length, I'm going to take my miter gauge. I'm going to put it in the channel in between my rip fence and the blade. I'm going to shut off my main power. I'm going to lift up my guards, and now to get an accurate length, I'm going to use this stop block. Okay, so the stop block is going to go against the rip fence. And what's going to happen is I'm going to push my board up tight to the stop block, then I'm going to pull it out, and I'm going to make my cut. Okay, as long as we set up our stop block to the length that we want, it should produce a board to that same length. Okay, so I'm going to set this to about 12 inches long, just like we did with the ripping. I'm going to adjust my fence, with my 12 inches, okay, measuring from the stop block. And my guards can go down, stop block back here. I'm going to butt it up tight to the stop block, hold it tight, slide out that stop block. The whole purpose of this is that it won't bind up as I'm cutting the board. I never want to use both the miter gauge and the rip fence at the same time, unless I'm not cutting all the way through the board. I'm cutting something like a little dado or a rabbit, a little channel cut. But if I'm cutting all the way through the board like a normal cross cut, you never want to use the miter gauge and the rip fence together. Okay, if it binds up, it can kick back on you. Okay, so this prevents that from happening, but it still allows us to measure out our final cut accurately. All right, so it's all set right now. I'm going to turn on my main power, turn it on. And I can check it for square, and I can check it for my length. And I want to wait until the blade stops before I remove this scrap. Whenever I was making a cut, I'm making sure that no one is behind me. If there is any kind of a kickback, then the board is going to come flying back here. And if you're walking behind here, you could possibly get hit with that kickback. Okay, so now that the blade is stopped, I can remove my scrap. All right, so we're done with our square up process now. We got our thickness, we got our width, we got our length, and all surfaces should be square to each other.